Okay, today's discussion.
Again, yeah, yeah.
Sure.
Sure.
Okay, well, welcome everyone to the meeting of Workers' International Network. Today's discussion is on the topic of Northern Ireland. There have been incremental changes over years and years in Northern Ireland, leading to a situation now where Sinn Fein has become the largest party at local council level. The Unionist Party, as a result, is in crisis. And there are all kinds of tensions resulting from that situation. The Marxist position, working out a genuine Marxist position on a situation like this, is difficult. It takes discussion, analysis, a knowledge of history, and an understanding of what is happening on the ground. And we're very lucky this afternoon, or today, should I say, because it's not afternoon for some of our comrades here. But we're very lucky today to have Kieran Mulholland, who's an activist in Ireland, and he's got a very good knowledge of the situation in Northern Ireland. And Kieran's going to speak to us. Would you like about 20 minutes, Kieran, to introduce this discussion?
Yeah, that's fine.
Okay, I'll give you a note after 10 minutes. And a reminder after 15. So it's over to you, Kieran. I'm very much looking forward to hearing what you're going to tell us.
Okay, well, thanks very much for the introduction, Ed. I hope everyone can hear me. I'm sorry I'm a few minutes late, but I was driving. I was stuck in traffic, so I just got in at the last moment and took a moment or two to log on. This is my third meeting, so I have a good understanding of the style of your meetings, which means that the introductions are relatively short, 20 minutes or so, but then there's a to and fro and there's time for questions and further discussion, and I can come back more than once. And I would imagine there might be a lot of questions from comrades who aren't intimately involved in the situation in Northern Ireland or Ireland. I see Harry's here, so Harry's a few miles from where I am now, so he knows the intimate situation. And obviously Jimmy and Finn are on the same island, on the island of Ireland, but others are from further afield. And I would have to assume a certain knowledge, the comrades have some sense of the detail, and so I can't colour in all of the details, but if comrades are uncertain about anything I've said, they can come back, of course, and ask questions. I will just maybe take 1 or 2 minutes to say who I am, because I haven't really been properly introduced to all of the comrades, because I think my political background is relevant to the discussion, and the comrades will have a better sense, a better feel of where I'm coming from if they understand my background. I became involved in revolutionary politics in January 1980, when Peter Taaffe, so all the comrades know who Peter Taaffe is, visited Northern Ireland, and he spoke in Ballymena, the town where I lived, at the public meeting, and I became involved at that stage at the age of 15. And I was attracted to the ideas of the then CWI, precisely because for the first time I found an organisation, a group, who could answer my questions about how we might build unity between Protestant and Catholic workers in order to overcome the historic problems in Ireland, including the historic problem of the division of Ireland and the divisions within the working class. I was a member of the CWI, as it was then, until 2019, at which point I was on the executive of the Irish Socialist Party, which was the CWI group in Ireland. I was on the International Executive Committee of the CWI. At the time of the split, the CWI in Ireland went in 3 different directions, essentially, and I remained involved with one of those groupings, what became the ISA section, for a period of time. But at a certain point, I broke from that grouping, and I have remained independent ever since. I work very closely with comrades in the CWI grouping in Ireland, which is militant left, and I have a relationship with the ISA comrades and a relationship with Paul Murphy and Rise. The groupings that come out of the CWI, 2 of the groupings, in my view, have remained steady on the fundamentals of our position on the national question, but Paul Murphy and his grouping have moved away from our fundamental position. And if comrades want to hear more about that, we can certainly discuss it today or another day. I'm going to address the election specifically, but of course, every election, as we know, as Marxists, is a snapshot. It's a moment in time. It tells us something about current moods in society, about consciousness, but it also tells us something about longer term trends. I think this election in particular tells us a lot about longer term trends. The media story around the world has been that this is a watershed moment, that something very important happened in this election. And that is true, but it's simultaneously not true. It's not a moment where everything changed. It is simply a stage along a long journey from where we were to where we are going to. It is true, as Roger said, that for the first time since the foundation of the Northern Ireland state in 1921, a nationalist party is the largest party in the state. That has been true now since last year, when the Sinn Fein were the largest party in the assembly elections. Sinn Fein again the largest party in the local elections. But perhaps even more importantly, for the first time ever since 1921, nationalist parties outvoted unionist parties. So nationalist Republican parties are greater than unionist parties by a very narrow margin, but nevertheless, that's of some significance. Now, local elections in most places are fought out on local issues, but these elections were not fought out on local issues, which were very secondary. The elections were fought on the bigger issues, the constitutional issues, which essentially means that every election in Northern Ireland is a referendum on the future of the North. Where will the North go? In each election, that is focused around particulars, and in this election is focused around two different particular issues in each community. It wasn't the same issue in the two communities. For the Protestant community, the big issue was the Northern Ireland Protocol. And the Northern Ireland Protocol is the arrangement between the United Kingdom government and the European Union, which was signed into law now more than 2 years ago, which puts in place the new trade arrangements and the new arrangements around rules and regulations post-Brexit. And for Protestants, the majority of Protestants in all opinion polls, the Northern Ireland Protocol is unacceptable because in their eyes, and it's the reality, it puts a new border in the Irish Sea where there was none before. So in order to avoid a hardening of the border between the north and south of Ireland, it was agreed between the EU and the UK that there would be a new border in the Irish Sea. Now, it's complex, and obviously the economists might want to come back on that, but that's the reality of the situation. A majority of Protestants are opposed to the Northern Ireland Protocol. The Democratic Unionist Party, the largest Protestant party, withdrew from the local power sharing executive over a year ago in protest of the Northern Ireland Protocol, and they remain outside the executive and outside the assembly. So there is no functioning devolved administration at the present time. After the DUP withdrew, there was a prolonged period of negotiation between the EU and the UK to make changes to the Northern Ireland Protocol. And those changes were made and agreed a number of months ago. The new arrangements are called the Windsor Framework. And it was hoped by the United Kingdom government and others that this would be sufficient to satisfy the DUP and they would return to the power sharing executive. But it hasn't proven to be sufficient so far. There is definitely a wing of the DUP who are willing and considering coming back into the power sharing arrangement, but they're watchful of the harder wing of the DUP under the traditional unionist voice, which is a harder unionist party to their right. So they've been very careful and they did not return to the executive prior to the local elections, fearful of the impact on their vote. It is likely, even probable, that they will seek to return to the executive over the course of the coming months. If they have some further concessions from the British government and the European Union, even paper concessions, even if they're in writing only, and they have a financial package from the Westminster government in order to soften the blow, it's likely they'll return to the power sharing executive. So that was the single most important factor in the Protestant community, and it acted to an extent as a mobilising factor to mobilise the vote, but only partially. In the Catholic community, the single biggest issue was the very fact that the DUP are not in power, and for most Catholics, they interpret that as being nothing to do with the Northern Ireland Protocol. They see the Northern Ireland Protocol as being a smokescreen, and the reality, as far as they're concerned, is that the DUP do not wish to see a Sinn Fein First Minister, that the DUP do not accept the fact that Sinn Fein are now the largest party. And that has angered Catholics. The majority of Catholics see history moving in their direction, in the direction of United Ireland. They do not see why there should not be Sinn Fein First Minister. The Sinn Fein First Minister has been blocked, and they express their anger at the ballot box. The fact that these issues were mobilised in the two communities meant that the turnout went up in the election. It was 53% in the last local election, and went up to 56% in this local election. Not a very high turnout, so obviously 45% of the population didn't vote. But there was a differential effect on the vote. So the vote went up more in Catholic areas and went up in Protestant areas. And that single factor, the differential in the turnout between the Protestants and the Catholic communities, explains why, for the first time ever, the Catholic nationalist vote was ahead of the Protestant or Unionist vote. If there'd been the same turnout in the two communities, then the Protestant or Unionist community would remain just ahead. And that's why I say that this election isn't quite the watershed it seems, but nevertheless, it is important because it is a further step in the direction of a Catholic voting majority in Northern Ireland. And it's possible that will never be reversed. It's possible the next election, the Catholic nationalist lead over the Protestant Unionist community will be increased. But it's also possible that won't occur. It's possible the next election there will be an issue that mobilises the Protestant vote, and the Protestant vote will once again be larger than the Catholic vote. That's entirely possible. So in this context, it's important for us to think about the percentage of the population who voted for others. So 85% of the population voted for Unionist parties or nationalist parties, with about 43% to 40% breakdown in that vote. 15% of the population vote otherwise, they vote for other parties. And the party that is most likely to win the vote of those who are trying to vote outside the sectarian blocs is the Alliance Party, which comrades have probably heard of. The Alliance Party has been in existence since the early 1970s. Its vote has waxed and waned over all of that period. It's a party that is aligned to the Liberal Democrats in Britain and to the Liberal International. It's a party of the right. It's a party that has neoliberal policies. It's in favour, for example, of lower corporation tax, but higher taxes on working class people. It's a party of the middle class in the sense that its leadership are middle class and it has positions that favour the middle class. But increasingly in the last number of years, it has won a broader vote. It has won a vote from young people, and it has won, to an extent, a working class vote. The Alliance Party vote is mostly a Protestant vote at this point in time. It has much higher votes in some of the more Protestant constituencies than it has in some of the more Catholic constituencies. And in fact, the differential there can be as much as 25 to 1, a 25 times greater vote in some of the Protestant areas. So it appears to be at this stage a repository for the votes of a layer of Protestants, especially younger Protestants, more middle class Protestants who reject sectarian politics and are looking for and seeking an alternative. The Alliance Party has done well over the course of the last number of elections, and it did well again in this election, and it's pushing up towards 15% of the vote. One of the reasons it has done well is it has detached votes from both the SDLP, the Social Democratic and Labour Party, who are the competition for Sinn Fein in the Catholic community, who have lost out over time. And it also has detached votes from the Ulster Unionist Party, used to be the party of government in Northern Ireland, the dominant party, but which has lost votes over time to the Democratic Unionist Party. And the Alliance Party has also hoovered up votes from others, and especially from the Green Party in the last number of elections. The Green Party in Northern Ireland is part of the All-Ireland Green Party with a separate identity, but part of the same structure. It had 2 assembly seats in the recent past, and it had 8 council seats going into this election, but it lost 3 of its council seats and it lost both its assembly seats last year. Now, from our point of view, what is most important is the question of class and how class politics is built, and how we inject class politics into the situation. The class struggle isn't about elections. The class struggle continues before, during, and after elections. And in Northern Ireland, over the course of the last number of months, there has been an upsurge in industrial struggle on a scale that we haven't seen since the 1980s. There have been a whole number of disputes involving most public sector workers and some key groups of workers in the private sector. As we pointed out in the past, in the 1970s and the 1980s, in some ways, workers in Northern Ireland have been ahead of workers in England, Scotland, and Wales. So, for example, the Royal College of Nursing, which didn't have a single strike in its 120-year history until recently, the first section of the Royal College of Nursing to take strike action were nurses in Northern Ireland. They were ahead of nurses in the rest, in England, Scotland, and Wales. And similarly, the union called the National Union of Head Teachers, or the National Association of Head Teachers, has never had a strike in over 100 years until now, and the Northern Ireland head teachers were ahead of teachers in England, Scotland, and Wales. And this is a feature we pointed to in the past, where you can have an increase in tension, sectarian division, and conflict, and simultaneously an increase in class struggle. And we've also pointed to the parallel process whereby when workers move into struggle in Northern Ireland, they can sometimes be ahead of the class in the south of Ireland and in England, Scotland, and Wales. We've said repeatedly that there's never been a strike over the course of the last 50 years that has been broken because of sectarianism, when employers or sectarian forces have tried to break strikes on that basis to divide Catholics and Protestant workers. It hasn't worked, and that has been the case again in the recent period. So going into this election with an increase in class struggle and also an increase in some local campaigns around hospital closures, for example, around health closures, we might have expected an upward lift in the left vote. We might have expected class to be more prominent, class politics to be more prominent in the election than it was. So it is important that we understand why that is not the case, and we understand and consider the way forward from this point. Now, there were left candidates in the election of a limited number in a limited number of areas, and coming from different perspectives. And I think it might be interesting for the comrades if I just go through the various left parties that stood in the election in turn. Where am I, Ed? I can't see any time-wise.
You're about 13 minutes into your time.
30 minutes, okay, that's perfect.
13:13.
Okay, thank you. So in the election, there were left candidates, and some of these candidates in Northern Ireland might be seen particularly on the left, but they are objectively on the left, and I'll explain what I mean by that in a moment if we just go through the various candidates. For example, there are left candidates who are wholly based in the Catholic community, and the best example is Irish Republican Socialist Party, which is a split off from the official Republican movement, which was the split from the Provisional Republican movement in 1970. The IRSP is the political wing of the Irish National Liberation Army. It has stood in elections on a fitful basis, on and off, over the course of the last 40 years. For the last decade or so, it did not stand in any elections, but it stood in the Assembly election last year and it stood in the local elections this year. It had two candidates standing under that banner, both of whom got a credible vote, about 3 or 4% of the vote. But I think they were probably expecting to do better. They both stood in West Belfast and overwhelmingly Catholic areas. They probably expected to do better, and they were not in the running for a seat. A third IRSP candidate is elected already as an assembly or as a council member in West Tyrone, but as an independent, but he's well known to be an IRSP member. The IRSP repel Protestants, all Protestants, but also repel the majority of Catholics because their armed wing, the INLA, was notorious for its wanton sectarian killings and its general, from the point of view, even from the point of view of the paramilitaries, the general mayhem that it caused. So they will never be a credible force, but they will always be there with a certain constituency, a certain vote. Also, primarily in the Catholic community are the Workers' Party. The Workers' Party is the remnants of the official Republican movement, which was the majority of the Republican movement at the time of the split in 1970. But has dwindled in importance ever since, has suffered a number of splits, including a split about 2 years ago on the national question, where they had a more green, a more United Ireland orientated wing, which split away. So the mainstream Workers' Party stood 6 candidates in the election and did very badly, even by their own standards. The 6 candidates in Belfast, for example, only one got more than 1% of the vote, and the other 5 candidates all got about 0.5% or 0.75% of the vote. The Workers' Party are a party in decline. They have a membership which is based essentially on the membership they took 50 years ago and the family members of those, the next generation, because they are a form of left republicanism. Now, on the other hand, the Workers' Party, their platform, their positions are totally focused on class issues and on the need for working class unity. So they're in a sense, they're a species of right reformism, in a sense they're a species of left republicanism, in a sense they're a species of Stalinism. They're a very unusual formation. They are a group that you can work with to a certain extent, but they're very small and very isolated in Catholic areas and rejected in Protestant areas. The other main group in the comrades will have heard of is People Before Profit Alliance. Now, People Before Profit was formed by the Socialist Workers' Party over a decade ago, maybe 15 years ago now. It is broader than the SWP. It has a membership much beyond the SWP. It claims membership of about 3,000 on the island of Ireland, north and south. It has a number of members of Parliament in Southern Doyle, a number of TDs. It had 2 assembly members in Northern Ireland until the election before last. It went down to 1 at the last election. It had 5 councillors at the last election. But in this election, it went from 5 down to 2. Now, holding these 2 seats was an achievement against the Sinn Fein surge. But it does mean that the single assembly seat it now holds in West Belfast must be under threat, and it'll be difficult for them to defend that in the next election. People Before Profit's positions in some ways are a left position that is defensible and that I would agree with, but their orientation and some of their positions clearly, in my view, place them in the camp of left nationalism or left republicanism. They take positions that can only repel Protestants and positions that they know are attractive to Catholics who are looking for alternative Sinn Fein, but not on the basis of class, but on the basis of a harder position on the national question. So whilst people for profit in some ways raise a left banner, in other ways their position and the fact that they have gained a certain foothold in certain areas poses more of a threat than it does of an opportunity. Thomas may wish to come back on that, and we can discuss that. In the Protestant community, there was only one significant left development of it in any sense over the course of the last 30 years, and that was the emergence of the Progressive Unionist Party as a certain type of left alternative in the more hardline, the more downtrodden Protestant areas. Progressive Unionist Party was and is connected to the Ulster Volunteer Force, so it had a paramilitary connection. In the 1990s, it appeared to be detaching itself from its paramilitary past. It talked politics. In the 1990s, for example, it adopted Clause 4, the old Clause 4 of the British Labour Party. At the time that the British Labour Party was ditching Clause 4, it adopted Clause 4. But over a long period of time, it has dwindled in numbers, dwindled in influence, has moved to the right, and has moved firmly back into the camp of paramilitarism, and without any distinct identity now to carve out a distinct position from the Democratic Unionist Party. It has lost the last of its seats in Belfast, and it only retains one council seat in all of Northern Ireland, which is in the Coleraine area, and which is essentially the basis of a local individual with a good record. So you could say that the PUP as a separate party no longer has an electoral base, which of course it is what it is, but it's one of the warning signs of the future we need to be very aware of. If there is no possibility of a political outlet for certain there, then in those circumstances, there's more likely to be a turn towards the methods of paramilitarism. So
you've had about 20 minutes now, but what you're saying is very interesting. So don't feel in too much of a rush to finish. But
I'm kind of wrapping up now. Just like two further points. Yeah. So the other left candidates were two candidates who stood under the banner of cross-community Labour or cross-community Labour alternative. Now, cross-community Labour alternative was established by the Socialist Party, so the old section of the CWI, in 2016, early 2016. At that time, or previous to that time, we'd stood candidates in a number of elections under the title Socialist Party, in a whole series of elections, including Harry, who's here, who stood several times as Socialist Party member. In those elections, it was our belief at the time that we came up against a certain ceiling. There was a ceiling effect because the word socialist or socialism in Northern Ireland can be interpreted in ways which are not helpful when you're trying to build a cross-community class alternative. But in the Catholic areas, in the Catholic communities, all of the major parties describe themselves as socialist to one extent or another. So the Irish Republican Socialist Party, Sinn Fein calls itself a socialist party, the SDLP calls itself a socialist party. It's a badge of very little, apart from in a sense marking the person who carries the label as being on the part of the nationalist family. It doesn't say very much else about the individual. In the Protestant community, the word socialist means exactly the same thing. If you say you're a member of a socialist party, people interpret that in different ways. I think it might mean that you're a member of Sinn Fein. So at that time, we were discussing the possibility of both a broader formation and to an extent a rebranding, words that would in some way signify to both Catholics and Protestant workers that this particular political project was for all, was for both communities. We were discussing adopting the name Labour at the very time when Jeremy Corbyn unexpectedly became the leader of the British Labour Party. And suddenly the word Labour, the currency value, the value of that currency suddenly increased overnight. We were already in the process of discussing adopting the word with some disagreement in the ranks of the Socialist Party. We adopted the term, we adopted the word. At that time, the British Labour Party, which does exist in Northern Ireland, the British Labour Party has members in Northern Ireland, but it doesn't allow members to join the it allows people to join the British Labour Party in Northern Ireland, but not to stand in elections. British Labour Party, when Corbyn came to leadership, at perhaps 400 or 500 members in Northern Ireland. Over the course of 18 months, it went from 400 or 500 members to over 3,000 members. There was a sudden mushrooming, and there was sudden mushrooming of activity of the Labour Party, and there were relatively large meetings, all member meetings. I'm sure Harry's going to come in on all of this, but he's involved in all its detail. So we orientated to an extent towards the ranks of the Labour Party. We orientated towards other independent candidates who were coming through. There was a serious attempt in 2016, 17, 18 to establish a broader banner, to work with others, and to have an electoral platform to reach out to wider layers than we could under the title of Socialist Party. Now, time went by. We all know what happened with the Corbyn Labour Party. And by 2019, we were standing candidates in the local elections under that banner, but it no longer with an association with the Corbyn Labour Party. It was more a standalone. We had a candidate in Enniskillen called Donal O'Coffey, who was a Sinn Fein councillor in the past, who came over to the Socialist Party. He stood as cross-community Labour. He's done a lot of good work over many, many years, and he was putting down real roots in the area. And in the 2019 local elections, he was elected to the council in Enniskillen on about 10% of the vote. In local elections here, we have a single transferable vote, which means that you vote down the list, and he got elected on about the fifth or sixth count. That was a real breakthrough. That was very important. Within months, the Socialist Party in Ireland split, and Donal went with the CWI split, which is now called the Militant Left. And it meant that whilst he was on the council, he no longer had a support apparatus or a network around him, or a much smaller support apparatus and a network around him. I've worked with Donal very closely since that time, and we've fought a number of elections. We fought the local elections in 2019. We fought the Westminster general election December 2019. And our candidate was a Protestant woman called Caroline Wheeler, who stood in the Fermanagh South Tyrone constituency and got 750 votes, which is a very credible vote. We stood in the Assembly election in 2022 last year. Donal stood as the candidate, again at Fermanagh South Tyrone. And this year again, then we stood in the local elections on May the 18th. We stood two candidates, Donal in Enniskillen and Jerry Cullen in Dungannon. Now, Jerry Cullen was a councillor for the Workers' Party in the late 1980s, in the 1990s through to the beginning of the century in Dungannon town. He was a member of the Workers' Party at the outset of that period. The Workers' Party had split in about 1989, 1990 on a number of issues, on paramilitary links, but also on their links with the Soviet Union, with Stalinism. Jerry was part of the split which formed the Democratic Left organisation, which was essentially a rightward moving split from the Workers' Party, but it is more complex than that. And eventually he became an independent socialist on the council. We reached out to him in the last year, and he stood as the second candidate at Dungannon town. And even though he hadn't been a councillor for 20 years, he still had a base. He's still known in the town. He still continues to campaign and to work. We intended to stand more candidates, but it wasn't possible because for various personal reasons. So we went into the election with two candidates. Donal unfortunately lost his seat. He had 10% of the vote, and he would have needed about 7, 8% of the vote at the very least, 8 or 9% of the vote to have a chance of retaining the seat. But he gained 6.5% of the vote, just under 7%. So he's very close to retaining the seat, but just squeezed out. To us, that's a great disappointment, but of course it indicates that there is a real base there, and it was the objective factors, the national factors that ate into his vote in a way which would have been very difficult to counter. Jerry
Kieran, you've had 25 minutes now, Kieran.
Okay, I'll try and finish up now. Jerry Cullen got 3% of the vote, again a very credible vote. We'd have liked a greater vote, but again it demonstrates that there is a vote there. So the elections in summation demonstrates the long-term trends that we're very aware of, that a large proportion of the population don't vote, but for those who do vote, 85% will vote for the sectarian parties. Those who are seeking an alternative don't see many alternatives. The Alliance Party provides a partial vehicle. The Green Party has in the past, before profit due to an extent in Catholic areas, but there isn't a class alternative which appeals to both Protestants and Catholics. For us, cross-community Labour is the best vehicle, is the best approach. It doesn't have to be that label, it doesn't have to be that banner, it can be changed. But cross-community Labour, the idea is to bring together groupings from different directions, people who come from a left Republican direction, or from a Stalinist direction, or from a Trotskyist direction, but also individuals and trade unionists and community campaigners. And we would hope at the next election, which is the general election, which must take place within 15, 16 months at most, that there will be candidates again standing under the cross-community Labour banner or something similar, in order to build, because we have to build for the future. It is a difficult period. We know that cross-community Labour meetings, for example, are like this meeting. They're too male and they're too old. but nevertheless, they attract very, very good people, and we have to build. We have to build from where we are, and we'd like to think that we will move into the next election in good order. And between then and now, the class struggle continues. The industrial movement has not ebbed at this stage. It's still on the offensive. And we'd like to think over the course of that period that there will be points, there'll be opportunities and places where, places where we can build and we can develop cross-community labour so that it can pose a credible alternative for these some workers at the next election.
Okay, thank you very much, Kieran. That was a really very interesting introduction with a lot of carefully prepared detail, and looking at the difficulties as well as some of the potential that there is for beginning to take the workers' movement forward. So I'm sure that opens up a lot of scope for an interesting discussion, and I'd ask comrades to raise their hands if anyone wants to come in. Keep in mind, Oh yeah, we've got Harry here. Okay, Harry, please come in.
Yeah. Thanks, Ed. As Kieran has explained, there's been a trend, population trends that have now given Catholics a very tiny majority amongst Protestants in Northern Ireland. And that has some way reflected in the elections that have taken place. Even though the turnout is, it's slightly over half, it doesn't necessarily translate that we're necessarily going down to an All Ireland. There was a poll last year, obviously before the council elections this year, arguably not the biggest poll, it's about 1,400 people, but it does give you a rough trend in the consciousness of people here. And in the poll, 48% would agree to stay within the UK. About a third of the population here would support Irish unity. Now, what that actually is saying is that if there was, for example, and this is a burden really for Sinn Fein, if there was a border poll, even though, as Kieran has explained, they've got a majority now at Stormont, they've got a majority now in the district councils, it would not necessarily translate that even amongst Catholics, that there would be in any way a majority for Irish unity. They really do have, even though the elections have been progressively towards nationalism, it doesn't necessarily mean that even amongst the Catholic population that there's full support for Irish unity. Now, there are factors, I think, that has happened to this. There has been an increase, certainly towards Irish unity, and one of that is the consequences of Brexit. And even in the Protestant community, I don't think it's very significant, but certainly there's more people would lean towards Ireland simply because they're part of the European Union. But for Catholics, it's not necessarily that it's going to translate into that. So it's a bit like the Scottish National Party, the problem they have in Scotland. They really have a problem of selling nationalism to the Scottish people in the same way as what's happening here. And when you look at Stormont, most people certainly believe, on the basis of the Good Friday Agreement, well over 70% believe that that's the best basis for the way forward. However, when you see the trust and the survey and the poll points to this, Stormont, there's very, very little confidence and enthusiasm for Stormont that they can effectively do anything to address the serious problems in Northern Ireland, problems of austerity, health service, and so on. It's a very, very low ebb. And even in the UK government, there's a very lack of confidence that these institutions can really solve any of the fundamental problems that we're faced with today. So there's a crisis. You could say it's quite simply a crisis in capitalism, and a crisis that the institutions can really solve the fundamental problems that we're faced with. And never mind the national question, but on the local issues, it simply is not there. And even though we've had this massive surge in the Sinn Fein vote. I mean, opportunities, Kieran mentioned about the Labour Party, and that was a golden opportunity that could have perhaps transformed Northern Ireland. Kieran's explained the surge towards Corbynism would have transformed. Now, that initiative was destroyed from within. It was destroyed by the Labour Party. What happened in many constituencies in Britain, they closed down the Labour Party. We were under suspension for 8 months. Many members were purged. And then, of course, was the erosion, you know, perhaps lack of enthusiasm, even towards the end of the Corbyn initiative. But certainly when it comes down to the new leadership, the Labour Party is quite simply, it's effectively just a name only. We have a meeting. I'm still a member of the Labour Party. I'm still on the executive of the Labour Party, but it's completely dominated by the right-wing Stammerites. We don't effectively do anything at all. And one of the reasons is an election, of course, is that they were still banned. The Labour Party's banned here from standing candidates under the Labour Party name. That's been there since the 1970s. We still recognise the SDLP as the sister party here. But it was, and it does demonstrate, I think, there are opportunities, and we haven't had this opportunity effectively. You probably go back to the 1960s and the civil rights movement before there was such a golden opportunity to make a significant breakthrough. The Labour Party under Corbyn was an opportunity, but it was destroyed within. And the only other thing I want to mention about that Labour Party was the other effective party or group that actually brought it down was effectively the Communist Party of Ireland. There were members on the executive of the party that resigned en masse, and it was their aim to bring the movement down. They did do it quite successfully at that. So that initiative is now gone. We've got Stammer. There's nothing going to change, certainly in the short or medium term, about any orientation towards Labour at all. Just a final note, Ed, and that is maybe on a positive note, is where the fight back's taking place. And you're aware of all of the strikes that is happening, and there's an up the ante, if you want us now. I think there's a mood for really stepping up the strikes here. Kieran's brother, Patrick Mulholland. Patrick is Deputy General Secretary of one of the largest unions here, NIPSA, and he's been at the forefront. He was on television. It's big. It's on Stephen Nolan show. It's a very broad, watched or listened to and watched by many people here. And Patrick is putting forward the agenda of a campaign within the strikes and within the trade union movement of campaigns of civil disobedience. And there's a mood to really up the ante now in this campaign of civil disobedience. Now, exactly what they are and everything, you know, Patrick's outlined the suggestions, but that's really where the fight back takes place. And just a final note, and that is, you know, for once, you know, trade union leaders, bureaucrats, all that type of thing, we know all about them. But actually, at the moment in our trade union movement, Patrick Mulholland's partner, Carmel, is the General Secretary of NIPSA. So we have the General Secretary and Deputy General Secretary, two hardened fighters who are formerly of the CWI, and they're now part of Militant Left here. And the other main union is Unite, and we have the General Secretary as a former militant, really a very effective leader called Susan Fitzgerald. And she's just recently become the General Secretary of Unite. So really, to be quite honest with you, for once, for a very long time, there are in at least two of the main unions here fighting leadership that we can trust and depend on. And the battle is continuing. So that's why I think the battle's going to continue. It's going to be on the streets, through the trade unions, and we'll see what about the campaign of civil disobedience. That was one. Thank you, Ed.
Thank you, Harry. Next speaker is Finn.
Comrades, if you don't mind, I'll say a few words in Irish, which I'll translate. Is tábhachtach agus éifeachtach an ceiste bhfuil ag plé ag going ag an cruinne seo anocht. Mar leis an ceiste tá ag plé. Ní Party Sóisialachas, Party Sinn Fein. Níl Sinn Fein ábalta 1-5 a réitigh anois. Tá lán 5 na tithe, 5 na luacha agus ruí mar sin. Fiú bháin, níl ar ábalta an ceist náisiúnta a réitigh freisin. Tá Sinn Fein ag dul chun tosaigh freistin na tíre I dúsgurt agus deisceart, ach níl réitigh ag réitigh sóisialachas. What I said was that it's important that in a meeting such as this, that somebody would speak in Irish to some extent. And the point that I made was that, well, first of all, I said that it's important somebody contributes. Sinn Fein, even though all the emphasis is on Sinn Fein is not a socialist party. And none of the problems that society faces in housing and cost of living will be solved by Sinn Fein. Not even the national question will be solved by Sinn Fein. They're unable to create that unity of purpose between the different layers of workers that would be essential for such a thing. It's absolutely important to put the emphasis on the need to build a new mass-based Labour Party centred on workers' activity and centred on the unions. We need to have an organised, all the examples that Kieran gave are very significant, but we need to have an organised workers' party, a mass workers' party with socialist policies that can draw the allegiance and support from across the communities. And that is the central argument we need to put time and time again, regardless of the gains we make in individual areas. Now I want to make a point about Sinn Fein. Sinn Fein is being presented now as some kind of left-wing mass movement. So I want to mention a few things about the origins of Sinn Fein. Sinn Fein was founded in the early part of the last century around a policy of dual monarchy, copying the example of Austria and Hungary. They came to prominence after the 1916 uprising. They came to prominence because the British media described the opposition to British presence in Ireland as Sinn Feiners. And when a series of elections happened, and of course there was a vacuum on the political front, and Sinn Fein were able to cash in on that. Sinn Fein then became the biggest party in the 1918 election. A settlement was reached in talks in Downing Street, and then Sinn Fein split. And the parties that split from Sinn Fein at various times left behind a rump, and Sinn Fein remained a rump from the mid-20s up until more recent decades. Fianna Fáil, which is a Conservative party in the south, Fine Gael, they all came from a split in Sinn Fein. Now, a significant development in Sinn Fein happened, and Kieran referred to this in 1970. There was a national conference called in 1970 to discuss whether Sinn Fein should should participate in parliamentary elections. That was the issue. But that wasn't the real issue. The real issue was that Sinn Fein, up to 1970, had been moving to the left, taking part in mass activity, housing campaigns and other campaigns on the left. And Sinn Fein was becoming a left-wing organisation. When the conference took place in 1970, I was at that conference, by the way, in 1970, when the split took place. And there was an attempt made prior to the conference by Fianna Fáil, who were the government at the time, to persuade Sinn Fein to leave all this left-wing politics and instead to focus only on a military campaign in the north. They offered money and support and even financed a journal to that extent. So when the split happened, it had been fomented by Fianna Fáil and the right in order to destroy a left-wing movement that was developing within Sinn Fein. The group that split away became now the Provisional IRA. The group that remained was the official IRA, and likewise Provisional Sinn Fein and official Sinn Fein. But neither organisation has managed to create a non-sectarian socialist organisation. It's impossible for the Provisional Sinn Fein, or what's now called Sinn Fein, to achieve that. And as Kieran explained, the Workers' Party, which is the remnants of the old official Sinn Fein, are not going anywhere at the present time. But I want to go back again to this thing about the need to build a mass party. It's one thing to have trade union activity, but we need to develop a strategy to turn that activity towards building something which is of lasting consequence in terms of a socialist movement. Sinn Fein will not resolve the national question. Sinn Fein will not resolve any of the questions which society is being faced with at the moment. And that needs to be spoken of honestly and openly. But there is a vacuum. And that vacuum, to some extent, as Kieran explained, is being filled in local areas by individual comrades and candidates who stand for socialist policies. But irrespective of that, unless there's a movement towards a mass party, then it's not going to go anywhere. There is no question wherever of this thing being resolved by demographics. And in fact, I think the discussion about the Protestant and Catholic vote is it's a blind alley. It's a pointless discussion, absolutely pointless discussion, because it's not about Catholics and Protestants. It's not about nationalists or unionists. You know, they're all influential issues in the political discourse. But somebody who votes one party today might vote for a different party tomorrow, depending on perspectives. The idea that you can kind of outbreed Protestants is an idea that's in there for it's been there for a long, long time. It's not a new idea. And it's now been celebrated as some kind of an achievement, that because there are more Catholics, not by comrades here, obviously, but by people around the right-wing Republican movement, celebrate the notion that Catholics are now in a majority, as though that was a deciding factor. We have to keep our arguments away from that kind of an issue. Keep our arguments away from even opinion polls sometimes can fool you into thinking that things are moving in a direction. That's not the case. The only way Ireland can be united is by a socialist policy. It can only be united through socialism. It can't be united on a bourgeois basis because of the divisions that exist historically. And that needs to be spelled out as a reply to those who think that you can have a border poll and suddenly there's going to be a majority and all of a sudden there's going to be united Ireland. That's not the way things happen. It creates conflict and division and deepens and worsens sectarianism. So I do think, in conclusion, we need to put a lot of emphasis on how are we going to build a mass workers' party that can appeal equally to Protestant and Catholic voters, and that has a socialist policies, and that can campaign for it. The only possible resolution to the national question is a socialist United Ireland, or a socialist workers' republic, if you want to spell it out in that way. But there is no in between. There's no intermediate step where the middle class of either community can come together and reach an agreement that would resolve the questions that are being faced in the North. I'd be interested to hear Kieran's ideas about how this might develop. How might organisations on the left and trade unions come together, trades councils also, as a first step towards building a mass workers' party in the North, and then linking up, because we need them in the South as well, linking up with unions on both sides of the border with a view to creating a socialist United Ireland. Thanks, comrades.
Thanks very much, Finn. Next speaker in the discussion is Matthew.
All right, if I can get the cameras working.
Yep, we can hear you. Come in.
Yeah, all right. No, just trying to make sure the camera was working. Thanks, comrades. I thought the what was said previously just now was very useful. I think that most, just about all of that's true. I think that, I mean, the thing is, what we're seeing is really a political stalemate, and yet I think the other thing is that we should consider Ireland as a whole, because the other thing that's going to happen in early on next year, of course, is the elections in the south, which are likely to result in Sinn Fein forming at least a part of a government, and of course this of course is Sinn Fein will merely continue, as comrades say, will basically continue the neoliberal policies of the previous governments, and of course will totally blow out the ambitions of various bits to the left, saying they can have some kind of deal with the Sinn Fein or ride, get some kind of power or leverage through deals with Sinn Fein, which is clearly actually going to make a deal with whichever right-wing forces. I think the other factor, of course, is the interest of imperialism. It's quite clear, I mean, obviously Ireland existing as an imperialized nation. And in the interest of the US in particular, obviously now clearly taking a hand and saying, well, Good Friday Agreement is ours. We put it together. We want it to operate in a certain way, and basically telling the British that which way they can and can't operate, as well as obviously the rest of the government in the south. There's also the nature of the southern economy. I mean, the southern economy essentially operates as a tax haven economy for multinational companies, particularly American ones. And of course, it means that the entire political system is enthralled to that form of corruption. I mean, to the point, as we've seen, where the southern political machine refuses to even collect the tax that it's due. It's an extraordinary position where the government refuses to take money from companies, but that's happened in the south. In terms of Northern Ireland, I mean, Northern Ireland obviously has a real. In a city like in Glasgow here, it casts a very long shadow. You have to live with it all the time. But what the system have actually set up, of course, the Stormont system, is completely broken. Well, it's not designed to function. It's actually very peculiar. It's a confessional parliament, in which obviously the most important things people say is, well, are you a prod, or are you a Catholic? And that's the first thing everybody is asked. And actually the status of yourself as a member of that assembly, as a representative, is actually decided on how you answer that question. The only other parliament I think in the whole world which operates on that basis is in Lebanon. It's a phenomenal thing. I mean, it's and to say that is either sustainable or in fact something that you can actually operate within to any great degree, other than obviously denouncing it at every point, it's not sustainable at all. And clearly, as we see, the point that we get to the point where the DUP, either DUP or Sinn Fein have shut the thing down for most of its existence, and the DUP clearly won't actually have it operate on the basis that they don't hold the First Minister post. There's no way that they're going to allow that. So in fact, the thing will sit there, and they'll continue doing that. And the thing is, obviously, what it then does is to maintain this sort of rotten state. The politics are held in this sort of rotten stasis. And it's a question of as Cromwell said, how do you break out of it? But it has to be, looking at it, across the entire island, rather than with the artificial border down the middle. Thanks.
Okay, thank you, Matthew. Next, we're going to Steve Zeltzer. Steve, are you there?
Yeah, I'm here. Thanks.
Okay, please come in, Steve.
Yeah, thanks for the report of what's going on. I mean, I wanted to raise two issues that I think need to be addressed, and that is the need to build an international campaign, a united front working class campaign against privatization. And one of the failures of the, I would say, revolutionary left, is an inability to build any kind of real united fronts internationally with working class forces, trade unions, and others. So I think for our point of view, and I'm with the United Front Committee for Labor Party in the United States, the need to build a united front against privatization, linking up workers and unions around the world is critical. And there needs to be a political struggle to do that in the working class and the left. So what effort you think should be made towards that end in Northern Ireland to build that kind of international movement? And the second thing, what is the role of the left in the issue of imperialist wars? Because Britain is with the United States and actively intervening in Ukraine, supporting NATO, and supporting the encirclement of China with the AUKUS agreement. So what role are the unions, and is there any united front against imperialist war in the working class and the unions? In Australia, there's a growing movement against the proposed U.S. nuclear submarine base and Port Kembla, and most of the unions in Australia against this military alliance. So, what is the role of the unions and left in Northern Ireland on that? That's it.
Thank you, Steve. We're going to David Hempson.
Yeah, well, look, thanks again for a very illuminating lead off. There are some basic issues which I feel are important to state, although many comrades are very experienced and know all about this. But I do feel that the terrible polarization, the paralysis in a sense of politics around sectarian leadership, even if that's moderating a bit over time, is terrible, but it wasn't inevitable. And I do think we need to just cast back our minds a little to, what I've heard and heard directly from people about the struggle of socialists, including many, maybe some of those even present today, during the civil rights movement in the North, which is to give, Catholic people the rights to attend schools as they want, the right to a job, the right to access work within the civil service and so forth. There was almost appalling discrimination against Catholics, which is what has led to these the polarization. Well, not completely, but as certainly the material part of the drive against Protestantism from Catholics, and the encapsulation of whole communities, which I understand is still the case. In fact, I understand that even now, the communities, let's just say neighborhoods, are being even further polarized. Well, not polarized, but let's just put it this way. The demographics are that the Protestants are hanging together, the Catholics are hanging together. And that seems, a disgusting development at this time, with even the talk of re-establishing fences in Northern Ireland between different communities. It's unbelievable that these internal divisions can be even made, into concrete walls and the like. So there is this is a horrific society in many ways, which our comrades have fought very strongly in the 1960s and early 70s, to break. And this has been, and there were achievements, along the road, until the in a war which started an internal war and a war of insurgency of a particular kind, and the most horrific massacres of people with bombs on one side, and then of murdering, from on both sides, but from the Protestant militias as well. And the idea that Protestants are still demanding the right to march through Catholic areas and to triumph, with triumphalism and trying to celebrate, the past victories over, a part of a community is still, still blurs the mind to think that could happen, in a civilized country. So I just want to touch on that background, that our comrades have fought against these horrors, fought against the rise of individual terrorism, and fought to give class answers to the issues north and south, which actually, as Finbar so eloquently put, are in the past have been and still are today the only way in which the issues can be resolved. Now, just some questions. The lead-up, contained many important details, about the voting patterns and so forth. But could I ask, these are mainly taken, it seems, from a local government position. And, what would be the case? Can we read a local government as a substitute for what would happen at a more general election? And what would the in what way are they similar, or what way are they different? Another important development, which I think is we need to look a little more at, is the development north and south. In other words, the Sinn Fein has developed tremendously in the sense to the south. It's developing as well, it's a pseudo labor movement, if you could call it a pseudo socialist party of a kind. It hops around on one thing to the other, if I understand correctly. Sometimes, on the question of of water and the water rates and so forth, and then jumps off and jumps on. So in other words, they're just maverick in terms of their actual class position or the political position they put over. But the fact that they can rise in numbers and get a large proportion of the of Parliament, and it seems could win in the next round in the South, is definitely a pole of attraction in the North. On the other hand, as has been eloquently explained, it's unlikely that that's going to break the polarization in the North, because it's actually no answer to the actual deep needed social needs, the deep social needs, North and South, on the question of housing, jobs, education, training, health services, and the like. And apparently Sinn Fein has done a pretty miserable job in relation to, particularly on the health issues, which is important for us, to know. The question, as always, is, how can we build under these circumstances? And what in the leadership, in the lead-off, it came over as very fragmented, astonishingly fragmentation on the left. In what way can we intervene or help build an alternative which is, in the sense, broad-based? In other words, building something which has a future vision to become a mass Labour Party, but without avoiding, shall we say, necessary links to existing groups because they're there and because they have some base, without just perpetuating that terrible fragmentation, on the left, of which we've heard a few details. I didn't pick up all the last details about the strategy. Maybe we could come back again on that, Kieran, just to put that forward so we have it, firmly in our mind. But thanks very much for an excellent lead-off.
Well, thank you, David. Carol, you've just put your hand up. Would you like to come in? And then possibly Kieran, after Karen's spoken, we'll go back to you for a little bit to respond to some of what's been said.
I just have a very quick question.
Go for it, Carol. Yeah.
Okay, there are massive demonstrations and strikes in England and around other parts of Britain, and I'm just wondering whether these strikes are having any impact on either Northern Ireland, which it's still connected to, or in Ireland otherwise, and what kind of connections, if there are any, are being made by left-wing organizations in Northern Ireland in support of the strikes that are going on in England, because whatever happens to the economy there is obviously going to have an impact on Northern Ireland. And this is one way of building sort of beginnings of an international movement that we obviously absolutely have to have if we're going to defeat capitalism being an international system. So, when I hear I have friends that live in London who talk about the strikes there, but I'm curious about the connections, if there are any impacts or anything about any connections between what's going on in London and what's going on in Northern Ireland.
Thank you, Carol. Kieran, would you like to come back on some of these points, some of these questions? It's not the end of the meeting, by the way, because there'll be time for other comrades to come out after you've spoken.
Oh, no, that makes sense. I'll come back on some of the points. But I'll just start the last question, Karen, about strikes. Now, the movement, the workers' movement in Northern Ireland is both separate, has its own identity, but it's also integrated into the Irish workers' movement in the sense that we belong to the unions here belong to the Irish Congress of Trade Unions. So you've got an all-Ireland Trade Union Federation, and the unions here are part of that. But the majority of unions in Northern Ireland are extensions of British unions. So Unite, for example, which is a very large industrial union, extends into Northern Ireland and the south of Ireland. Then you have unions like Unison, the public sector union, extends from Britain into Northern Ireland, but not into the south of Ireland. And then you have some unions that are Northern Ireland unions only, like NIPSA, the Northern Ireland Public Sector Alliance, which Harry has mentioned, which is the equivalent of the civil service unions in Britain, but has its own separate, distinct identity. So we're integrated into both the All-Ireland trade union movement and to an extent into the British labour movement. With regards to the recent wave of disputes, Northern Ireland has been at the centre of most of the disputes. So if there's a pay deal for the civil service, for example, or a pay deal for health workers, or a pay deal for teachers, either it's all the one pay deal in Northern Ireland, England, Scotland, Wales, there's the one pay deal set for all of the component parts of the United Kingdom, or it's separate, but there's an indirect connection. So if there's a 10% pay deal in one jurisdiction, it's likely to be 10% pay deal in another jurisdiction. So we've been involved in all of these disputes. The only major exception is the rail workers. The railway system in Northern Ireland is quite small, and we don't have the RMT, for example, or ASLEF unions in Northern Ireland. So apart from that very important dispute, otherwise very central to what's been happening. I could say much more about that, but there isn't time. Finn's asked the question, and then David, I think, asked the same question about where to from here, in a sense. How do we build from this point? And maybe just deal with that quickly, including this question of fragmentation on the left, and how to get beyond that fragmentation. Now, we all accept sometimes fragmentation is necessary. There are groups that you can't work with for a variety of reasons. That happens. But I think, to borrow an anarchist phrase, sometimes the example of the deed, the propaganda of the deed is important. And that's where these two candidates stand as cross-community labour in Fermanagh and Tyrone is very important. Fermanagh South Tyrone is a UK Parliament constituency. We now have an organisation there with some base in the area. It's a coming together of political groupings in the loosest sense of the word, in the sense that Donald, the councillor in Enniskillen, and the people around him are members of the militant left, the CWI grouping. Jerry Cullen in Dungannon and the people around him come out of that official Republican Stalinist tradition. There's also a grouping of individuals in the area who would have been associated with the Communist Party of Ireland in the past. So you've got different political groupings working together, and myself, of course. There's the genuine backing of local trade unionists. So the local trades council in Fermanagh Trades Council, essentially, to all intents and purposes, backs cross-community labour. So that hasn't happened in Northern Ireland. A trades council coming in behind an election candidate hasn't happened in this way for some decades. There've been very important campaigns locally, for example, against fracking. So an environmental campaign drawing in green activists, and some of those activists are part of the cross-community labour project. Hospital campaigners, other campaigners. So in essence, it is just what we need to build. What we need to build everywhere, all across in all advanced capitalist countries, but especially in Northern Ireland. We need to bring together local activists on the ground from different political traditions or no political tradition, and demonstrate in practice that type of united front work is not just possible, but is attainable and can deliver results. And the fact that we had the votes that we did have, so 6.5% and 3% of the vote, might not sound very high, but compared to the Workers' Party vote, less than 1%, compared to the vote of the Socialist Party, for example, which I forgot to mention, which is just over 1%, it's a credible vote. It's a vote to build upon. So can that be replicated across Northern Ireland? Well, I think it can in some areas. There is evidence from the past, the evidence of history, that in large in large towns outside Belfast, that you can build local campaigns which can achieve electoral success and can achieve success in struggle. And we need to consider how we can do that over the course of the next cycle of elections. But you also have to remember this is not just about elections, as Harry talked about. It's also about campaigns and about struggle. And we have this very peculiar situation now in Northern Ireland, where in many ways, if we use the word backward, but we could say it's backward politically in certain sense. We have the two largest unions in Northern Ireland. NIPSA, probably the largest union. The General Secretary is a Trotskyist, elected by the membership. There's 3 Deputy General Secretaries. 2 of the Deputy General Secretaries, one is a Trotskyist, one is somebody who works very closely with comrades. The conference was last week. At the conference, the delegates elect the president, the vice president, and the treasurer, all on the left, all 3. The General Council, the executive body of the union, majority on the left. There was a cross-community Labour fringe meeting at the conference. There's about 120 or 130 delegates at the conference, and 30 attended the cross-community Labour fringe meeting. That's how you build, that's how you achieve it, that's how you do it. Being fully aware of all of the challenges, fully aware of how difficult it is, but not shrinking from the challenge or not avoiding the challenge by putting your hands up and saying, well, the time is not right, maybe in the future, but not for now, which is essentially the position of the Socialist Party, which is in the future, but not for now. For now, we have to build the revolutionary forces, meaning us, but we can't reach out to others. It depends on developments, depends on the class struggle and how the class struggle develops, but also depends on the negative developments. And Finn's contribution, all the contributions have been excellent. Finn's contribution, you know, the big picture, it is very important. This idea that there's something to celebrate about Catholics, the Catholic population growing, the Protestant population shrinking. There's something to celebrate that in some way that's a motive force of history, or that's progression. I think we have to be very careful about that, and we have to always challenge that. In no way does it, you know, is it a positive for the future. The balance in the population changes. Balance of the population staying the same isn't positive for the future either. We have to move away from that. But the point is that sometimes the role of Marxists is to state things as they are, and that means we have to state the negatives as well as the positives. So state the positives, but the negatives, I think, are profound. If the Protestant population, the majority of the Protestant population, but some think differently, but the majority of the Protestant population who are in favour of the link with Britain, the link with the United Kingdom, begin to feel they're on the back foot, begin to think that elections don't matter anymore, but we cannot win an election. That's very dangerous for the workers' movement. This election that's just passed 2 weeks ago, the turnout in the most Catholic constituency in Belfast was 60%. The turnout in the most Protestant constituency was 40%. So that's a 50% difference, you know, 50% higher turnout in the Catholic areas. As Catholics feel they've got something to vote for. That says to me that in that Protestant constituency, which is a Protestant working class area, that many Protestants, especially younger Protestants, don't see the point in voting any longer. We have I've mentioned the article, comrades may have seen today, that there was a leak of a police document several years ago where the police estimate there's 12,500 members of Protestant paramilitary organisations in Northern Ireland presently, you know, active members of the UVF and the UDA. If this was Britain, that would equate to 500,000 members of armed parliamentary organisations, if you like, in abeyance, not on the streets at this point in time, but they're a reserve army. And I think that's something we have to be very concerned about. And given the shrinking Protestant population, the shrinking Protestant working class areas, 12,500 young working class men in the more downtrodden areas, I think is a warning sign for the future. As Finn said, it's all about building a new mass party and how we will achieve that. But I think I've maybe explained briefly just some of the concrete steps that can be taken and can be taken on a wider basis. We just need comrades who are able to work with each other in order to achieve that and break down some of the barriers on the left. The groups on the left, David, you know, your point about fragmented groups, we're talking about all very small groups, not large groups. And most of the groups, again, I referred earlier to this conversation of older comrades from the past. Most of the groups, it is older comrades from the past. That is the problem. The new generation aren't there at this point in time. That's a real challenge. I will try and answer all the questions now and maybe go back to the discussion.
Okay, thank you very much, Kieran. Would any other comrades like to come in to add something to the discussion, or even just asking a short question? Yeah, Jimmy, please come in.
Yeah, comrades, I just wanted to focus in on one or two points. One is the question of the Northern Ireland Labour Party. Harry and myself are members of the British Labour Party, and it's a strange position to be in. But we had a number of meetings of the section of the British Labour Party, which is based in the Republic that I'm a member of, which is also a member of Labour International, and that's how we have the membership. We had a couple of meetings through an organisation, the Socialist Labour Alliance, which developed within the Northern Ireland Labour Party during the period following Corbyn's rise. And that grouping in the north was a very, very positive grouping. It was comrades like Harry and Michael and a few others that would have been familiar to me. But there was a number of other comrades there, young trade unionists, mixed with community activists from both sides of the sectarian regions. And there was no worked out program. There was no definite method devised that was raising demands. But the conversations were taking place. The conversations were asking the questions. Now, the possibility that I saw was that if the Northern Ireland Labour Party was, or the Labour Party in Northern Ireland was to develop, that these group of comrades represented a really good potential to raise and develop and become a left opposition within that grouping and to play a serious role in it. But the Labour Party died, and it simply did that. It just died. Now, what was going on was Sinn Fein were making a push on the so-called border campaign, not the military campaign of the 50s, but an electoral campaign to abolish the border. And this campaign was getting support in some trade unions, not necessarily the members of the trade unions, but leaders of the trade unions and influential people within the unions. Now, there was a common denominator appeared to me, and that was that a lot of those people who were pushing the Sinn Fein agenda were sympathisers or actual members or supporters of the Communist Party. And it turned out that you had a development of people who should have been on the left, should have been promoting an independent Labour Party, actively obstructing trade unions, supporting the Labour Party, and rather encouraging trade unions, north and south, into supporting Sinn Fein. Now, Harry already made reference to the role on the ground of the the Communist Party within the Northern Ireland Party, where they effectively sabotaged the party. But they weren't the only ones, because also coming from London, during Starmer's days, the line coming from London was the Labour Party in Britain is a member of the European left, and we have an agreement with the SDLP that to recognise the SDLP as a sister party, and therefore not to support the Labour Party in Northern Ireland in standing candidates in opposition to the SDLP. Now, the fact is that there is no such rule. It was an invention. Nobody has yet pointed out where that rule or that interpretation comes from. But it's interesting that when Corbyn disappeared and the party started to collapse, the comrades in the north that we were in contact with also found the obstruction on the exact same arguments coming from Starmer. It was from Starmer supporters, that it was a convenient thing not to have an excuse not to allow the Northern Labour Party to develop. Now, that is class sabotage from both sides, from the so-called left and from the actual right. And it has to be identified as such. But it seemed to me, and I had an absolute frustration on it, that you had a situation where you had an opportunity for a short period of a party that was growing with activists and growing with new generation of people coming in, and their own leadership was handcuffed, and the people putting those handcuffs on were the people in London. It was an absolutely insane situation. But the one thing that I just want to say is the common denominator seemed to be the CP influences around Corbyn and the actual CP people on the ground here pushing the pro-Sinn Fein agenda. And the one thing that I've always remembered was the Irish Labour Party back in 1918 accepted under pressure of the then rising Sinn Fein. They accepted a policy that Labour would not contest the 1918 elections in deference to the rising Sinn Fein. And the Sinn Fein of that period went into the trade unions and got the unions. They ran an active campaign, but the agenda was not to promote the good of the members of the trade unions. It was not to promote the good of the working class in Ireland. It was to promote the good of Sinn Fein, which was a cross-class, non-class, and mishmash of Republicans and nationalists, with some, and I do accept that there were some people with socialist consciousness, but they were in the background and were kept in the background. I just got to leave it at that. The summit is that there's been a historic example of a criminal act committed by Labour in deferring back the Sinn Fein a century ago, and the real parallel developing again in the attitude of the CP through the unions and through its support for Sinn Fein again. And they've got to be called out on that.
Okay, thank you, Jimmy. Are there any other comrades who would like to come in to make a contribution, ask a brief question, make a small point? Okay, well, in that case, Kieran, can I ask you to sum up the meeting and try and answer some of the points that have been raised and point to some possible conclusions?
Yes, thank you, Ed. Yes, I mean, a lot of really good points raised, and as I said, this is my third meeting, but I have to say I'm very impressed by the quality of these meetings. They are stimulating, and I hear things that I've never heard before, I'm not aware of, including here in this discussion about Ireland, but Northern Ireland. To my surprise, I guess, new material has been brought forward. In terms of some of the questions, I can't go into all of this in detail today, but Matthew, I think, began making some important points about the Stormont system, how peculiar it is, and since then there's been a dialogue, a discussion in the chat about the Lebanon and that direct analogy, and I think it is a direct analogy. The Stormont system, it didn't come out of nowhere. Political theorists, it's been theorized by political theorists, and they talk about elite accommodation on a consociational model. I don't know whether comrades have heard of that before or not. If you Google it, you'll find it. Elite accommodation on a consociational model. When you think about what it means that the ruling class determine that genuine coming together of populations is impossible. So what you have to do is you go to the elites, you go to the people who lead, and the leaderships come together and they accommodate. They don't agree, but they accommodate on a consociational model. So you have a power sharing agreement. And the example is always given is the Lebanon, that was the solution, the problem of the Lebanon. And that has been put forward as the example despite the civil war in the 1970s. So the first power sharing agreement in the Lebanon was instituted in 1943 on the basis of this balance of power, that the president, the prime minister, the speaker of the assembly had to be, from the different religious communities. And that held from 1943 until the mid-1970s, held for 30 years, with a brief eruption of violence in 1957, I think it was, when there was a conflict over fishing rights in one town. The conflict over fishing rights suddenly erupted into violence on a more widespread basis. But to put the lid back on, but in the mid-1970s, they couldn't put the lid back on. And the reason they couldn't put the lid back on is because demographic change meant by that point that the balance of forces had changed, that the Shia Muslim population had grown, no longer felt represented in the corridors of power. And rather than being a simple solution, a redrawing of the agreement, it erupted into a civil war which lasted for many years and cost 120,000, 150,000 deaths. So the Northern Ireland solution is essentially the same. It's a consociational model. an acceptance that the two communities will never come together, but instead you have to put some in arrangement which prevents conflict, prevents violence. And of course, it can work on a short-term basis, and you could argue that it has worked for the last 25 years, except that it hasn't. Over the course of the last 25 years, there's been no functioning government for about 50% of the time. So 50% of the time, the government has just collapsed because the parties can't even agree to sit in the same room and to enact legislation. When they are in power, there's very little legislation is ever enacted, and everything becomes a point of contention. Even trivial issues become a point of contention, and major issues like the use of the Irish language that's been used half an hour ago, it becomes a point of contention. So all they can ever do is agree to disagree, but there's never genuine agreement. Now, what will happen next? I think it is more likely that there will be a return to the executive in the autumn. It's not entirely excluded that won't happen, but I think it's more likely that it will. I think the mainstream leadership of the DUP want to go back into government. They have a right wing, they have a hard right wing, and they're personified by Ian Paisley Jr., Ian Paisley's son, who's said in the last few days that he's not sure it'll ever happen. And then they have the traditional unionist voice, the even harder unionist party looking over their shoulder. But I think on balance, it's more likely they will come back in, even though they don't like the fact there's going to be a Sinn Fein First Minister. I don't think the analysis which says that they will not accept that under any circumstances is correct. I think it's more likely they will come back. They'll come back. They will then reenact the neoliberal policies of the United Kingdom government, Sinn Fein and DUP together, as they have in the past. But at some point, it'll collapse again because it is just prone to collapse. When there is an executive, that's better for the class movement, because if there's an executive in power, then working class people can see who the enemy are. The enemy are the parties who hold the levers of power in Northern Ireland. When there's no executive, then the enemy is Westminster, the enemy is the Tories in London, and the local parties get off the hook, and the local parties can say this, that, and the other they don't really believe. Now the arrangement is all about an acceptance that the two communities will never come together. But as David said, the polarisation is terrible, but it's not inevitable. Now, the polarisation is very real. There are about 60 peace lines in Northern Ireland, 60 walls dividing communities. In Belfast alone, the walls stretch for 20 miles in total, a number of different walls in different places. I mean, I went to Berlin a few years ago and saw the remnants of the Berlin Wall. And when you see the Berlin Wall, when you come from Northern Ireland, what is striking about it is how small it is. It's not a very high wall. Now, obviously, there were armed guards and watchtowers, and people were shot trying to get across the wall. But the walls in Belfast are 3 times as high. They're 30 metres high between the different communities. And they're still there 25 years after the Good Friday Agreement because the communities don't feel safe. People think they still need the walls. And in fact, there are more walls now than there were in 1998. The geographical separation of communities, people living in different segregated housing areas, increased after the Good Friday Agreement. The rate of increase has slowed. So that separation into separate communities at the moment, it isn't happening just at the same pace, but there's no reverse process. So majority of people either live in an area which is majority Catholic or majority Protestant. The number of genuinely integrated areas across Northern Ireland is very small. But it didn't have to be like this. And in the 1960s, as comrades have already mentioned, there was a coming together of the communities. There was a tendency to live in the same areas. There was a greater integration in the workplaces, and there was a greater integration politically, which is given voice by the Northern Ireland Labour Party, but also the Republican Labour Party, the Irish Labour Party, which operated in the north, and independent Labour parties in various towns like Warrenpoint and Newry, and to an extent in Derry, which is quasi-independent. And there was over 100,000 votes were being cast in elections for Labour parties by both Protestants and Catholics. And that showed the potential that was there. When the civil rights movement erupted, which is mostly about the rights of Catholics, as Finn mentioned, but also about the rights of poorer Protestants who also lost out on the question of voting, for example, and the qualification to vote in local elections. It could have been a cross-community class campaign if the trade union movement and the workers' movement had taken the leadership, but it didn't. It abdicated responsibility. And because it abdicated responsibility, sectarian forces came to the fore, and we had the cataclysm that followed of the 50 years of the Troubles. But it could be different and can be different. Just a couple of other questions quickly. I think, David, again, can we translate the local government elections into every other election? And essentially we can in Northern Ireland. Every election is essentially the same. Local government elections actually tend to favour the smaller parties. So the fact that this election went very much against smaller parties is actually a very big negative, because in the Assembly elections, the Westminster elections, those elections favour the larger parties. The only caveat is that the Westminster election, in the Westminster election, Sinn Fein tend to do not so well, and the SDLP do well, but Sinn Fein refuse to take their seats at Westminster, whereas the SDLP will take their seats. And a lot of Catholics don't really agree with Sinn Féin's policy of abstentionism. They'd rather their representatives went to Westminster. The SDLP tend to give a bit of a lift there. Otherwise, one election's the same as the other. Comrades have made points about Sinn Féin in the south. Maybe I won't go into because we don't really have time. Maybe that should be a topic of further discussion at some point in the next few weeks, given that Sinn Féin are likely to be the largest party in the next election in the south. Steve asked very important questions that I don't have immediate answers to. So he asked a question about the need to build united working class campaign against privatisation internationally. Privatisation is a big issue in Northern Ireland. So the United campaign in defence of the hospital outside Enniskillen, which is very important in our election, the Southwest Acute Hospital. Essentially, that's an issue of privatisation, because the hospital has been built using the private finance initiative, private sector money, which takes decades to repay at a ridiculous rate of interest. So the hospital is unviable in a capitalist sense because of privatisation, and so it is an issue that ought to be generalised and internationalised. The question of imperialist wars, when certainly in Northern Ireland at the time of the first Iraq War, the first Gulf War, the second Gulf War, and the invasion of Gaza, repeated invasions of Gaza, for example, there have been vibrant, dynamic anti-war movements in the north, but not on this occasion. But I think that's reflected everywhere. I think there aren't vibrant, dynamic anti-war movements anywhere because of the complexities of the situation in Ukraine, Russia, and because of how it's seen by many, including on the left, who don't have a clear analysis. So there is no, there is no developed anti-war movement. Jimmy made really interesting points about the Communist Party, Sinn Féin campaign and the unions, etc. So again, I won't go into that. Maybe we could come back to some of that in a further discussion, more focused on the South. I might just wrap up at that point. Maybe draw Comrade's attention to written material. The Internationalist Standpoint website has a number of articles that I've written over the course of the last 6 months. So there's an article just posted yesterday on the election results, and I'm going to post a second article which is a bit more detailed about how the left did in the elections. I wrote an article about 2 weeks ago before the election, looking forward to the election, which draws out some of the points I've made today. And then 3 or 4 other articles went back over 6, 9, 12 months, just issues around the class struggle in the north that might be helpful to comrades. I sent all the links to Roger, so maybe they could be circulated, but comrades may not even need to do that. If you just go and look on the website, you'll find the material. And if any comrade wants to contact me directly, of course, and I can deal with their questions separately.
Well, thank you very much, Kieran. It's been an excellent discussion with a lot of very valuable information and insights. I think the comrades who've participated have all said some important points, and you've been really good in leading the discussion, Kieran. I hope we see you more at our meetings, because I'm sure your contributions could be welcome in other areas as well. So thanks once again, and thank you everyone who's participated. I think perhaps I should go over to Roger for a moment or two, who may say something about next week's meeting.
Yes, thank you. I agree with you. It's been a really enlightening discussion, one of many, but I hope that all the comrades will return and throw light, as they have done today, on all the other issues. One of the biggest mobilizations we've seen in Europe in the last decade, in fact, the biggest, you could say, was in Greece, where we had for over several years, we had mass mobilizations, we had occupations, we had general strike after general strike after general strike. We had the crystallization and then election of a left party, Syriza, and we had the referendum in which 2/3 of the population, 2/3 of the electorate, voted to defy the European and the world bankers, and it ended overnight with the complete capitulation by the left government, and in subsequent election, of course, a defeat for that party, for Syriza. We've had another election recently in Greece. There were some hopes that maybe Syriza could make a comeback. I think they were always highly exaggerated, and really hardly credible. And the result is that there was actually an unexpectedly large victory for the right-wing government. So the question is, what are the perspectives in Greece, and what lessons can be learned? And we're very privileged to have a comrade who's been at the centre of these struggles throughout that period, Andros Payatsos, and he's going to speak next week. I think it's going to be a really important discussion, and I hope everybody will come and perhaps bring along some of their own their comrades and friends.
Okay, thank you very much, Roger. Thanks to all the comrades who participated in this meeting, and I'm looking forward to seeing you next Sunday, if not in some other meeting before. Thanks very much.